Hello and welcome. I'm Catherine Banwell, your host for today's program. Today we're going to discuss clinical trials, what they are and how they work, and debunk some misconceptions along the way. Before we get into the discussion, please remember that this program is not a substitute for seeking medical advice. Please refer to your healthcare team about what might be best for you. All right, let's meet our guest today. Joining me is Dr. Seth Pollack. Dr. Pollack, welcome. Would you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Seth Pollack. I'm a medical oncologist here at Northwestern University Medical Center. And I specialize in treating patients with cancer. And I have a specific interest in patients with a type of cancer called sarcomas.
Excellent. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. And here to share the patient perspective is Sujata Dutta, who is on the board of the Patient Empowerment Network and is currently participating in a clinical trial. Sujata, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Pleasure to be here, Catherine. Hello, Dr. Pollack, and hi, everyone. My name is Sujata Dutta, and I was diagnosed with a cancer called multiple myeloma in December of 2019, and I've been on a clinical trial since September of 2020.
Thank you for that information, and we're going to go into that further in just a few moments. Let's start with a basic question, Dr. Pollack. What is a clinical trial?
Yeah, it's a basic question, but actually it's sometimes it can be harder to answer than you might think. I think everybody has an idea in their mind about what a clinical trial is. You're going to test a new approach, but actually, there's a whole variety of different things that could be a clinical trial, right? A clinical trial, a lot of the times it's testing a new drug, could be testing something for the very first time, could be testing something in combination with other drugs for the very first time. It could be testing a standard approach, but doing it in a new way. It could even be giving less treatment than we usually do. For example, if there's a very intense, harsh standard of care treatment, we might even have a clinical trial where we try a little bit less and see that patients do just as well. So all of those things are clinical trials, but really the clinical trial in its heart is a very organized and careful approach to testing a new treatment strategy for patients.
Okay. What are the phases of a clinical trial?
Yep. So the phase 1 clinical trial is usually when we're testing something for the first time in however we're doing it. So it could be the first time we're testing a new drug or the first time we're testing a drug in combination with other drugs. And the real thing about a phase 1 trial is that the main goal of the trial is to look at the safety and tolerability of the regimen. That doesn't mean that we're not really trying to figure out if the regimen works. I mean, that's also one of the most important things, but the most important thing for a phase 1 trial is making sure that it's safe and tolerable. A phase 2 trial is where we sort of shift and we're still making sure and double checking that the drug is safe. But now our main focus becomes on the efficacy of the strategy. So now we're trying to really figure out if this is a strategy that seems effective enough to go to a phase 3. And a phase 3 is a big multi-center trial. Frequently, those will be placebo-controlled, where a lot of the times there'll be a randomized trial where we really try to absolutely prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that a strategy is effective. And those are most of the types of trials that patients will encounter.
Okay. Thank you for providing clarity around the phases. Before we move on to safety and benefits of clinical trials, let's hear from Sujata. Sujata, I understand that you went through a series of treatments for your multiple myeloma, which is a type of blood cancer, including a stem cell transplant. At what point did you and your doctor consider a clinical trial might be best for you?
Yes, you're right. I was diagnosed with multiple myeloma in December. And so the line of treatment or the standard protocol is that you go through like what is called an induction therapy, which is like a few cycles of chemotherapy, which get you ready for a transplant. And the transplant, the hope is that it kind of washes away or cleans off all the cancer cells for you, or at least brings the cancer to a very, very minimal level. And I did go through 6 rounds of chemo, which got me ready for the transplant. And I went through the transplant in June of 2020. However, I'm amongst the very few, a small percentage of people that just did not respond to the transplant. So I was at the same point as where I started. So it was a little bit disappointing, but my doctors, were there to help me understand the situation. It was a hard pill to swallow, but anyways, there were options, and that's what I feel very hopeful about with multiple myeloma, is that there are so many options available today, to treat or to at least bring the disease under control to a very large extent. And I'd expressed a desire to be in a trial very earlier on, so my doctor did know that I would be. That I would lend in a year to listening to what the trials were. And it just so happened that there was a trial that was very apt in my situation, like somebody who'd gone through a transplant and, who was, they have some criteria, and I was able to meet that criteria. And so for me, it seemed to be like the right decision to make. And so that's how I agreed to be part of the trial.
Mm-hmm. Can you go into some detail about why you thought a clinical trial was a best thing for you?
Yeah, so initially, before knowing much about this trial that I am in part of, I just had the desire to be part of a trial, because I was always in awe of patients who had been in trials before me, and because of whom I was benefiting with like whatever regimens, medications, combos, whatever were happening. And so from that perspective, I always wanted to give back in some way. Unfortunately, we are having more people being diagnosed with cancers, with multiple myeloma. And so I was very motivated to do something for the community that I was now part of. And so I had my transplant at Mayo, and I knew that they had a whole bunch of trials, and I had access to different types of trials. And so I thought, so that was my first motivation. And it just so happened that, as I said, my experience with transplant didn't go the desired way. And so, when I heard that there was a possibility that I could be part of a trial, I kind of like leaned into actually agreeing to be part of that.
Yeah, it sounds like that was the next step for you.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to address a list of common concerns about clinical trials that we've heard from various audience members prior to this program. And this is probably the most common. I will be a guinea pig. Dr. Pollack, how do you respond to that?
I know that is a common concern. I mean, I think the thing that people have to understand about clinical trials is there is just so much oversight that happens for these clinical trials. Every document, every procedure is scrutinized by multiple committees. There's a scientific review committee. There's a review board, IRB, that reviews these. Many of these trials are reviewed by the FDA, and they're reviewed by your doctor and your doctor's colleagues that are also participating in the trial. So every detail is discussed at length. In fact, a lot of the times there's a lot more structure to being on the clinical trial than just routine clinical care, because they've thought so thoroughly about when everything needs to be done and what the right timing of is for the various procedures.
Right. And another concern that people have is clinical trials are my last resort treatment option. What do you say to that, Dr. Pollack?
Yeah, no, that's a common misconception. So we like to have clinical trials for every phase of the patient's cancer journey, because we're trying to make every single part of the cancer journey better. So, I think a lot of people think that, okay, well, when they hit their last resort, that's kind of the time to try something new. Even in the very earliest parts of the cancer journey, even in the diagnosis phase, sometimes we'll have clinical trials where we try different imaging modalities or look at things a different way in terms of the biopsies. But then in terms of the curative treatments, when somebody is in the curative setting, we don't usually try something very brand new, but a lot of the times we'll try something that is very, very effective for patients at the end, and we want to try and make the curative strategy even better. So a lot of the times for those patients, we'll have new therapies that are very safe and established that we're trying to incorporate earlier into patients' treatments because we know they work really well, right?
Yeah.
And then even in patients who have incurable cancer, a lot of times it's better to try a clinical trial earlier on, just because sometimes the clinical trials have the most exciting, really the new therapies that are bringing people a lot of hope. And a lot of times you want to try that when you're really fit and when you're in good shape. So that's why I think that, you really want to think about doing a clinical trial, when the opportunity arises.
Yeah, because it could be beneficial to you, and it's certainly going to be beneficial to other people. This is this fact or fiction? It will be expensive. Dr. Pollack.
That's fiction, because the way the clinical trials work is we go through everything very carefully to figure out what things are standard and what things are unique to the clinical trial. So if you are getting chemotherapy, you're going to need blood work. You're going to need the chemotherapy drugs. You're going to need some sort of imaging, CT scan, or whatever your doctor would do. And all those sorts of things are considered standard. So your insurance company is billed for those. Then there's a bunch of things that are considered research. For example, if there's special research blood work, maybe there's an investigational agent that's being added to standard chemotherapy. Those things are billed to the study. So you don't actually have to pay anything extra. It's just like you're getting the normal treatment as far as you're concerned. I mean, that's the way it always is. And I haven't had any of my patients ever get into real problems in terms of the finances of these things. It always works very straightforward, like standard therapy.
Okay, that's good to know.
Mm-hmm.
The logistics will be a nightmare, and I don't live close to a research hospital. Sujata, did you have that issue?
Yeah, that's a very interesting one. And actually, I'll share my experience. I did have this concern about logistics because I got my transplant at Mayo, which is a 2-hour drive, Mayo Rochester, which is 2 hours drive from where I live. And so when I got to know about it, literally me and my husband were like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Like, it's not just me. My husband is my caregiver. He has to take the day off to drive me to Mayo, wait till my treatment and drive me back. Then we have boys who were distance learning at the time. And so what do we do with them? Like, do we drop off at a friend's or take a favor from a friend and so on and so forth? So the logistics was an issue. And we literally said, oh, thanks, but no thanks. And we walked out of the room and we came downstairs and my husband was like, what the heck? Like, my team understands everything. And I fortunately work for a very good employer and they understand everything, people first. And so he was like, I can figure this out. Like, let's do it. If this is what's going to help you, then let's just figure this out. And, at the time it was so good. And I have total respect for Dr. Pollack, you and everybody in this medical community. My doctor who leads the trial at Mayo, she actually said, like, why don't you check with your local cancer center? Maybe they are also approved by FDA and they may be able to administer this, treatment to you. Unfortunately, at that time they weren't. But, we were like, we're going to go ahead with the trial. It doesn't matter. Like, my husband was like, I'll take the day off. You don't worry about it. And then 4 months later, my institute did get approved by FDA. And so I was able to transfer from Mayo to my local cancer center, Frontier Cancer Center, which is like 20 minutes from home. And so, so there are options. I know that it can be an issue and it can be overwhelming at the time, which was the case with me, but, I was able to overcome that. So maybe there are options available and that the patients can consider.
Yeah. Dr. Pollack, do you have anything to add?
I think those, the logistics and the location are real concerns with clinical trials. Clinical trials do sometimes require you to have an extra visit. Sometimes they're a little bit less flexible in terms of when you can get your medication. If you're getting a standard treatment, your doctor may say, it's probably okay for you to wait an extra week. Whereas sometimes on a clinical trial, not always, but sometimes they could be a little bit more strict about when you're supposed to get certain things. And likewise with the travel, for some people that can be an issue. I mean, the clinical trial is not available everywhere. I mean, Sujata was very lucky that she was able to do the clinical trial she was doing close to home, but that doesn't always happen. So I think that's an important thing to talk to your clinical team about. Yeah.
Some patients feel that clinical trials aren't safe. Is that the case, Dr. Pollack?
No, I mean, clinical trial, we go through, as I was saying before, these clinical trials are extensively vetted. So the safety is, of course, one of the things that we look most carefully about. But as I was saying before, like with any treatments, I mean, cancer treatments have toxicity. That's a common problem. So, and when you're dealing with something brand new, sometimes there is a little bit more risk. So when you're talking about these very early stage phase 1 trials, you probably want to talk to your doctor about what sorts of toxicities you can expect and where they are in the phase 1 trial. Are you the first person ever to receive this new drug? And if you are, nobody's making you go on the clinical trial. So, it can only hurt. It can only help to get more information, right? So you should ask your team about it. You should find out. Most of the time, there's going to be a lot of patients that have been treated already, and they can tell you, they can't give you definitive data about how things are going, but they can maybe say, hey, I've already treated a few patients on it and they seem to be doing great. Yeah.
So you need to weigh the pros and cons of
you do the need to weigh the pros and cons. Now, when you're talking about these phase 2s and phase 3s, I mean, these are drugs now that have really been vetted for their safety, and we have a lot of data about it. And even in the phase 1s, I mean, it's not like these things are coming out of nowhere. They've been scrutinized. We really expect that they're going to be safe. But, we're doing the trial to prove it. So it's a good thing to ask about.
Yeah, I would also add that it's so closely monitored that, safety is a top priority. It's like front and center. So, the advantage, I think, with being, on a trial is like the close monitoring of the patient, exactly for this reason. If something is a miss, it's going to be picked up as quickly as possible, and any issues are going to be addressed as soon as. So I think safety does get addressed pretty quickly.
Good. Okay, that's good to know. Another concern is I'll get a placebo. Dr. Pollack, what is a placebo, first of all, and is that true in a clinical trial setting?
So there are clinical trials with placebos. It's a real thing. And what a placebo is it's a pill, and it's made to look just like the real pill. But it doesn't have any active drug in it. So sometimes people will say it's a sugar pill, but it may or may not be sugar, but it'll probably be something without a taste. And it's an inert substance that is not going to affect you at all. And your doctor won't know whether you're getting a placebo or not. So they a lot of the times they'll call these things double blind, because your doctor doesn't know, your pharmacist doesn't know, and to unblind you, they have to go through special procedures to find out whether you're on the study drug or not.
Would a placebo be given solely, or would it be given in addition to this new drug that's being tested?
Yeah, so it's unusual for a placebo to be given solely. Usually, there'll be a clinical trial where you're getting the standard treatments, or standard treatment plus the new drug, or standard treatment plus the placebo. So no matter what, you're getting the standard treatments. There are still some trials where, and these are usually for patients with very advanced cancer who there's not really any treatment options that are good, where they will randomize people to just be on the standard drug versus the placebo. Sometimes what they'll do is if they want to do a trial that's the standard drug versus a placebo, they'll do the imaging very frequently and they'll have a crossover. So a crossover means that if you were randomized, everybody gets to be on the new drug, but some people will have to go on the placebo first. So, and then they watch you very closely. So if you get randomized to go on the placebo and your cancer starts to grow, they figure it out very quickly. And then they give you the opportunity to go on the new drug.
Oh, I see. Okay. I'll be stuck in the trial forever and I can't change my mind. Sujata, did that happen to you?
No, I mean, when I finally agreed and signed the dotted line, it was made very clear to me that it was voluntary. Like I was volunteering to be part of the trial and I could get out of the trial at any point of time. So in my case, I'm in phase 3 of a trial. The first, commitment was for 2 years. And then the next is 5 years. So again, like it sounds daunting to me right now. 2 years is coming to an end in July of this year. And I'm like, wow, 2 years are over already. And then 5 years, I'm like, I'm not thinking about that. But again, it was like at any point I could just say that, I've had enough or whatever be the reason, I could get out of the trial. So no, yes, there is an option.
Mm-hmm. Can data from trials even be trusted? Dr. Pollack, is that the case?
Well, of course, it can be trusted because the thing with the clinical trial data is that you really see the data. There's all kinds of scrutiny making sure that the data is reported accurately. Now there's a whole other conversation we could have as to whether we could interpret the data differently. And sometimes that is an issue that comes up, but the data is reported very accurately. So there are statistics that are very well understood that, and the bar is actually pretty high to say that one arm of the trial was better than the other arm of the trial. So if patients have better survival on one arm, if we say that, usually that means they did considerably better, enough better that it wasn't a random chance that patients just happened, one extra patient did better on the treatment arm. No, there were enough patients that did better that the statisticians can go through it with a fine-tooth comb and they can be absolutely sure, up to exactly how many percent sure they can tell you, 0.05% or less chance of error, that this was a real difference between the treatment arm and the study arm and the standard of care arm.
I think you mentioned 2 words. One is trust and one is data. So Dr. Pollack mentioned a lot about the data. I think the trust is also a very important thing. I like to go with positive intent because I do not have a reason to believe like my doctor has some ulterior motive to, suggest a clinical trial. And so I trust them wholeheartedly. So I think that's the first hurdle is like, you have to trust the system or, what is being proposed to you, because as Dr. Pollack said, it's gone through a lot of vetting. So, a recommendation to go through, be part of a trial itself is vetted by your doctor when they make the recommendation. So, have faith, have trust that they are making a good recommendation. And then, of course, the data, I don't know much about that, but, as I said, I trust it. So I would trust the data too.
Of course. Some patients feel like they're going to lose their privacy. Sujata, did you feel that at all?
No, not at all. I mean, with everything else that is also taken care of, like my information or whatever is not made available to anybody. And so, obviously there's a lot of paperwork that goes in. I had a huge pile of paperwork to go through, but I think that's a good thing for my, peace of mind that I knew that, my information was not going to be shared outside of the study, the trial, etc., and things. So no, I don't think that's a problem.
Okay. Beyond these misconceptions, is there anything else you hear, Dr. Pollack?
Well, I hear a lot of people really interested in clinical trials. I mean, especially, I treat some patients with rare cancers or with unusual presentations, and I think people are very excited to be a part of something that could be new, that could be the next wave. A lot of times the clinical trials have new things with the most exciting science that could be the future of treatment. So I think a lot of people are excited about clinical trials. And I also hear some of the reservations that you're expressing. I think usually when patients ask, they, their questions are very straightforward and easy to address so that people can make their own decisions.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Pollack, I'd like to go back to you and ask you the same question about privacy. Do patients need to be worried about that?
No, I mean, look, in our crazy modern world, there's concerns everywhere. But the clinical trial is very, very careful. Whenever possible, we just use we use the medical charts. And then, we have a very stringently protected database that's storing people's information, but it's de-identified. We have a separate key to figure out who the patients are, and then we try and limit the use of the patient's name or any identifying information about them beyond that. So, and your information is not shared. Like, for example, if there's a drug company involved in the trial, your information is not shared with the drug company. You have a new identifier that is unique and not traceable back to you, that is provided to whoever, if there's outside groups that are working on the trial with you. So your information is very carefully protected, and everyone is very conscious about issues regarding privacy.
That's great to know. Sujata, there's clearly a lot of hesitation and misconceptions out there. What would you say to someone who's considering a trial but is hesitant?
I would say speak to your provider, speak to your doctor, and get all these myths kind of busted to say like, oh, is it going to be expensive, or whatever those questions are. And then through that process, also try and understand, what is it that the study is trying to achieve? How is that going to be beneficial to you? So in my instance, it wasn't the last line of defense. It was just one of the processes or combos that would help me. And so, that was important for me to understand. And then a little bit of education as well. So I was asking, I have questions on my phone every time I meet my provider, and I did the same thing. So I think that one of the good practices is keep your note of your questions and have those questions ready. And no question is silly. All questions are important. So ask as many questions as you can and use that opportunity to, educate yourself about it. And maybe you realize like, no, I don't think it's working for me, or I don't think this trial is good for me. But it's important to have that conversation with your provider. That's what I would recommend highly.
Excellent. Thank you. Dr. Pollack, if someone is interested in participating, how can they find out about what trials are even available for them?
Yeah, I mean, the best thing to do is to start by just asking your doctor if they know about any clinical trials. And if you are, a lot of the times the clinical trials are run at the big medical centers that may be close to you. So you could ask your doctor, if there's any clinical trials at the big medical center even. Or I always think it's a good idea to get a second opinion. You could go get a second opinion at the big medical center that's close to you and ask them what clinical trials are at your center. And sometimes they'll be conscious about some of the clinical trials that may be even run around the country. And you can ask about that as well.
Would specialists have more information about clinical trials than, say, a general practitioner?
I specialize in rare cancers. So a lot of the times the general practitioners, they've got my cell phone number, and they text me and they say, hey, do you have a clinical trial going on right now? And that happens all the time. But yeah, the specialists will usually, because frankly, there's so much to know, and the general practitioners really have a lot to keep track of with all the different types of diseases that are out there. Whereas at the big centers, the specialists, part of their job is really to keep their tabs on what's going on with the clinical trials. So, they're good people to ask. Either, your local doctor could reach out to them, or you could go get a second opinion and ask.
There is also a lot of information, Catherine, on like sites such as like LLS or PEN or American Cancer Society, that they also publish a lot of information. Of course, I would recommend like once you have that information, then vet it by your specialist or whatever. But if you're interested in knowing more about clinical trials in general and like some that would work for you, then those are also some places to get information from.
That's great information. Thank you. I was going to ask you about that, Sujata. Well, before we end the program, Dr. Pollack, I'd like to get your final thoughts. What message do you want to leave the audience with related to clinical trial participation?
Yeah, I think clinical trials, it can be a very rewarding thing for a lot of patients to do. I think patients really like learning about the new treatments, and I think a lot of patients really like being a part of pushing the therapies forward, in addition to feeling like sometimes they're getting a little bit of an extra layer of scrutiny because there's a whole extra team of research coordinators that are going through everything, and getting access to something that isn't available yet to the general population. So I think there's a whole host of advantages of going on clinical trials, but you need to figure out whether a clinical trial is right for you.
Yeah. Sujata, what would you like to add?
Absolutely. Second, everything that Dr. Pollack is saying. And in my personal experience, like I wouldn't say everything is like hunky-dory, everything is fine. Like I'm going through treatment. I have chemo every 4 weeks. I started with chemo every week. That's when the logistics piece was like really difficult because like going to Mayo every week was not easy. But anyways, as the trial progresses, it's now every 4 weeks. But as I said, the benefits are huge because like I have labs every 4 weeks. I meet my provider every 4 weeks. So, we go through the labs and, anything amiss, I've had some, changes to my dosage because I've had some, changes in the labs. And so, there's a lot of scrutiny and which I like. But the flip side, or maybe for some, maybe like, oh, I have to have chemo every 4 weeks. Do I want to do that or not or whatever? In my case, I knew it and I signed up for it and I'm committed to doing that for 2 years. And so I'm fine with that. So I would say all in all, I see more benefits of being in a clinical trial. One, you're motivated to give back to the community. Two, you are being monitored. And so your health is is important to your provider just as it is to you. And so I highly recommend being part of a trial if it works for you and if you're eligible for one.
Yeah. Sujata Dutta and Dr. Pollack, thank you both for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of our partners. To access tools to help you become a proactive patient, visit powerfulpatients.org. I'm Catherine Banwell. Thanks for joining us.